Hey everybody, welcome to Lesson 3. Today we're going to talk about body cavities and membranes just very briefly, and then we're going to dive into the main portion of this unit, really of this entire section, this video today, head and torso regions. So, briefly I want to talk about body cavities and membranes. We really don't talk about these a whole lot in this class. If you take an anatomy and physiology class that's more focused on development, you'll talk about body cavities and membranes a lot, because a lot of structures, as you're developing from inside in the womb and even as you continue to age, a lot of things are going to be built around or based on these body cavities and the membranes that surround them. So, body cavities are a way that the body can maintain its organization. You think you can keep things like your brain and your spinal cord separate from everything else. You can keep your heart and lungs separate from the digestive organs, separate from the reproductive organs. So all of these cavities have their own membranes that allow this division to be maintained. Your dorsal cavity, otherwise known as the posterior cavity, is going to contain your brain and spinal cord. And you can even break those cavities up into the cranial cavity up here, which is going to house your brain. You can see on the left-hand side here. And it's going to contain the vertebral cavity, which is going to house your spinal cord. And that's going to run all the way through your vertebrae there. And you can see it on the right-hand picture here as well, the cranial cavity. This is a forward-facing one, so if we're looking at Bart here, cranial cavity sitting up here. In fact, I can even, he has a skull cap that I could reveal that cranial cavity there in there. That's going to house the brain, and then along on the back side is the vertebral cavity. The ventral cavity, otherwise known as your anterior cavity, remember the difference between anterior towards the front, posterior towards the back, is going to contain 2 or 3 cavities depending on who you ask. It's going to have the thoracic cavity. That's the one everybody agrees on. Thoracic is going to be the chest region. So this is your heart and your lungs are going to be housed in the thoracic cavity here. And they're really easy. It's really easy to see where the thoracic cavity is because it's housed by your rib cage. And down below, you're going to have the diaphragm is actually going to separate your thoracic cavity from the more inferior cavity, which is the abdominopelvic cavity. Now, the abdominopelvic cavity does sometimes get divided up into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. And you can see those pictures where those sit here down below in the image. Technically, though, they are a single cavity. There isn't really a membrane separating the two. The only reason that they are given these 2 different cavity names is because the abdominal cavity is going to be all of your digestive organs sitting here in what you would call your gut. And then the pelvic cavity is going to be housed in your pelvic bones here. So these are your hips right here. So down below, anything sitting inside here would be considered the pelvic cavity, which is going to be your reproductive organs. So you can see this is where things like your uterus would sit, although Bart is a male here. But the uterus would sit down in the hips. Things like your bladder are also located down there. The membranes that separate these are called serous membranes. It is not serious, although you should take them seriously. They are called serous membranes. They are going to cover these organs in the thoracic and the abdominopelvic cavity. The cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity kind of get their own little deals. We don't worry about those a whole lot because the nervous system is sometimes very complex. But the function of these membranes, these serous membranes here, is to reduce friction as these organs move. Think your heart is beating about 1 time per second. So each second you have this heartbeat. That can build up a lot of friction, and with a lot of friction you get a lot of heat. With a lot of heat, you have the chance to damage a lot of your tissues here. You really don't want to damage your heart or your lungs. Obviously, that makes life very difficult. So these serous membranes reduce that friction as these organs move to basically 0. I had one person tell me one time that it's basically the amount of friction that a bowling ball has on tile. It's almost impossible for that bowling ball to ever stop because there's so little friction on that tile. If you don't believe me, take a bowling ball and a very, very long tile hallway and just give that bowling ball a push, and I guarantee you it will go much further than you anticipate. But the serous membranes have two sides. They have a parietal layer. This is going to be the layer near the cavity wall. So think if we're talking the thoracic cavity here, the parietal layer is going to be near the ribs, or the layer that is near the ribs. The visceral layer then is going to be the side that is nearest the organ. So you can see our picture here, this visceral pericardium is specific to the heart. We're going to get to that in a second. But visceral, you can think visceral is usually talking about your guts. So that is on the organ side. Parietal is on the cavity wall side. So they are actually a continuous, we call them a double membrane that's just folded on itself. But we do give different names based on which side they are. The different serous membranes that we're most concerned about, the pleura, P-L-E-U, typically is going to refer to anything with the lungs as a medical prefix. So the pleura is going to be the serous membrane that covers your lungs. So think as you're breathing, your lungs are moving quite a bit, so that could cause a lot of friction, but you have the pleura that is able to reduce that friction. Pericardium, once again, refers to the heart. And you can see here the visceral pericardium nearest the organ, parietal pericardium would be nearest the cavity wall. And in between would be just this space, and sometimes there is some serous fluid that you can get in there. Basically, it just looks like water. And the peritoneum covers your digestive organs. So these are the three main types of serous membranes that are covering things in your thoracic cavity as well as your abdominal pelvic cavity. Now, getting to our anatomical regions, today we're just going to focus on head and torso regions. Tomorrow we're going to take a look at the limb regions. So really the best way to do these is just a lot of practice with them. We'll do some games, Mr. Ostrom says, and things like that. Flashcards could be helpful, although it's kind of hard to draw on flashcards. So I'd encourage somebody, if you want to create a Quizlet with some pictures, that would also be extremely helpful. You can quiz your friends, different things like that. But all of the ones that I have on here that aren't struck out are anatomical regions of the head and torso. Now, the ones that are struck out, we are going to talk about with the limb regions, so don't think you're getting off easy there. But as we go around, you can see the nasal region. Nasal, most of us are pretty familiar with as being the nose region. And one thing I do want to mention, spelling is important for these because there's some things where if you get the spelling mixed up, you end up talking about a completely different region. And so if you're writing this down, you're a doctor writing this down for somebody and you misspell it, then that can cause potential issues for the person, whoever you're giving that note to. So you do have the nasal region here being your nose. After that, the oral region, another one that we are tend to be pretty familiar with, is going to refer to the oral cavity. That is going to be your mouth. Cervical is going to refer to the neck, and that's going to refer to the entire neck. Kind of hard to see on Bartholomew here. We'll talk about it in class. But the cervical region being the neck, one way that you can remember just how tall the cervical region is that it's the first 7 vertebrae. So again, it's kind of tough to tell on Bart here, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So right here would be the cervical region. We'll talk about some tricks and ways to remember those here in a little bit, but that is the cervical region. Staying with the head region here, flip Bart back around, we have the frontal region. This is going to refer to the forehead. And you do want to remember that this is the frontal region because the muscle and the bone and the lobe of the brain that are located here are all based on this being the frontal region. So the frontal region is the forehead. Next up is the orbital region, going to be the eye. We like to call this hollow socket here the eye orbit. So most people tend to be fairly familiar with that as the orbital region. Next, we have the buccal region, going to be your cheek. I have also heard it pronounced buccal. I do think buccal is correct, but if you say buccal, I sometimes mess up and I say that as well because that's how I first learned it, was buccal. But this is going to be the cheek region. And again, another one that is important to remember because the muscle that is located here is named based on this being the buccal region. So that is your cheek region. After that, we have the mental region. I'm going to deal with the chin. So the point of your chin here is the mental protuberance. That's an important one to remember. The otic region is going to be your ear. Bart, he only has his external auditory meatus here. He doesn't actually have the auricles or the pinna coming out the side here, but the otic is the ear region. And on the back of the skull is the occipital region. So again, this one here, the bone back here is named based on this being the occipital bone. And guys, you can actually feel where that occipital region is because most guys tend to have a bump back there. Ladies, it's very rare for you to have a bump back there. But then the entire head region, we generally refer to it as the cephalic region. Moving on, we can have the sternal region. This is going to refer to the sternum, which is actually 3 bones here, but that is your breastplate region, the sternal region. Thoracic, once again, we talked about the thoracic cavity just a little bit ago. So thoracic refers to the entire chest region. You can also determine where the thoracic region is based on the vertebra, because remember the first 7 vertebrae were the cervical region. The next 12 are going to be the thoracic region. After that, vertebral, I'm going to refer to the entire spinal column here. Remember, this is your vertebral cavity. We also have the dorsal region. Dorsal, remember, meaning towards the back, so we can refer to this as just the dorsal region, referring to the entire back. Lumbar is going to be the last 5 vertebra of the spine. So again, remember 7, 12, 5. An easy way to remember that is based on when you might eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You might eat breakfast at 7 a.m., eat lunch at 12 p.m., and then take an early supper at 5 p.m., and that refers to our cervical, thoracic, and lumbar regions. So kind of a fun little way to remember that. Other ones that we have on here, the scapular region. We have the big, broad shoulder blade here, also known as the scapula. So this is going to be our scapular region. Down below, the sacral region. The bone just inferior to your lumbar bones is the sacrum. So that's why we call this the sacral region. It is not quite your tailbone. Your tailbone is down here. This is the coccyx bone. But over on the other side, if we flip Bart back around here, we have the mammary region. That's going to refer to the breast region. The abdominal region, again, abdominal pelvic, think here. Abdominal is going to be specific to kind of where your digestive organs are. Pelvic is going to be anything sitting inside the pelvic cavity. And then you have the umbilical region, otherwise known as the navel. So I don't think I forgot any on here. I apologize, my lights just shut off. I haven't been moving in here enough, I guess. But if you have any questions, please let me know. Please ask on the updates tab on Schoology. We're going to get a lot of practice with these in class because if we can get these down, it makes things a lot easier moving forward in this class as we talk about different structures, as we talk about different regions of the body.